Design elements are the basic units of any visual design, which form its structure and convey visual messages. Basically, these elements are the materials from which all designs are built. Line is defined as a point moving in space. Lines can be vertical, horizontal, diagonal, curved. They can have any texture or width, also known as line weight. They can be continuous, implied, broken. Different lines create different moods. Line is both a position and a direction in space, and the variables of line are size, shape, position, direction, number, interval, and density. And lines essentially create shape. Shape is the next element. It's defined as a two-dimensional area that stands out from the space next to it or around it due to a defined or implied boundary, or because of differences of value, color, or texture. Shapes are recognizable objects and forms and are usually composed of other elements of design. Shapes can be geometric, like squares, circles, rectangles, triangles, or they can be organic, which is basically anything that doesn't have geometry or straight lines to it. The next element of design is value and tone. It's the relative degree of lightness or darkness of an area. Brightness is measured in relationship to a graded scale or a gradient from white to black or vice versa. So every element in your design has a value from like 1% black to 100% black with infinite gray tones in between. And value is relative, meaning it is interpreted differently by its surrounding tones. The next elements are mass, volume, and form, and space, which are all interchangeable. A mass is a solid body or grouping of visual elements, line, color, texture, etc., that compose a solid form. Volume is the three-dimensional form comprising length, width, and depth. So three-dimensional forms contain points or vertices, lines, edges, and then planes, which are the surfaces. A mass is the two-dimensional appearance of a three-dimensional form. Form is best described as the way an artist arranges elements in the entirety of a composition within a space. It may also be described as any three-dimensional object. So form can be measured from top to bottom, height, side by side, width, and from back to front, depth. Form is also defined by light and dark. It can be defined by the presence of shadows on surfaces or faces of an object. And there are two types of form, geometric and natural. Form may be created by combining two or more shapes, and it can be enhanced by tone, texture, or color. The next element is type or typography, which is a fundamental part of any design it appears in. It can be used as text to read, as a shape, and as a visual element, where the choice of the typeface conveys an emotion or mood. Type, when used well, doesn't need a photograph or illustration to back it up. There's several different kinds of classifications of type. The first would be serif, where there's a small stroke that extends past the letter. And this is divided up into subgroups like Old Style, Transitional, Neoclassical, Clarendon, Glyphic, and finally slab serif, where the extended stroke is more squared off and blocky. And then there's sans serif, which means without the stroke. And that's defined into subgroups of grotesque, square, humanistic, geometric. And then there's script, which is calligraphic, handwritten or mimicking handwriting, usually features decorative curls, loops, and flourishes. And then the last is decorative. And these are very limited, usually typically for a custom logo and carry a specific mood. The next element is color, typically known as hue, which represents a specific light wave found in the color spectrum. It's the result of light reflecting back from an object to our eyes. The color that our eyes perceive is determined by the pigment of the object itself. Saturation gives color brightness or dullness, which impacts the vibrance of color. Values of color are created by adding black to a color for shade or white for a tint, and both reduce the saturation. Color theory studies the color mixing and color combinations. Color harmony is the idea of color combinations that are pleasing to the eye versus combinations that are not. And color contrasts are just two colors with perceivable differences in aspects such as luminance, saturation, placed side by side to create contrast. This includes dark and hue and temperature, saturation, and so forth. And then color schemes are a set of harmonious colors chosen for a design meant to be appealing beside one another and create an aesthetic feeling when used together. The last element is texture, which is used in 2D design to replicate 3D surfaces through various drawing or media techniques. On 3D surfaces, it is experienced by touch or by visual experience. Physical texture are the patterns or variations on a surface that can be felt by touching. Specific use of texture can affect the smoothness that an artwork conveys. Rough surfaces can be visually active. Smooth surfaces can be very restful to the eye. Light is an important factor for identifying the physical texture because it can affect how a surface is being viewed. Visual texture is the illusion of having physical texture. It can be decorative texture, which is added to embellish the surface, spontaneous, which is created in the process of making, or mechanical texture, which is created by mechanical means like printing. Principles of design are applied to the elements to bring them together into one unified design. How you apply these principles determines how successful a design may be. Unity and harmony are the main goal of design. When all the elements are in agreement, a design is considered unified. No individual part is viewed as more important than the whole design. A good balance between unity and variety must be established to avoid a chaotic or lifeless design. In short, the sum is greater than the parts. This is achieved through a combination of other principles, which I will discuss, but are not limited to: perspective, the sense of distance between elements; similarity, which is the ability to seem repeatable with other elements; continuation, the sense of having a line or pattern extend; repetition, elements being copied or mimicked numerous times; rhythm, which is achieved when recurring position, size, color, and the use of graphic element has a focal point interruption; and altering the basic themes achieves unity and helps keep interest. With balance, the elements of design converge to create an arrangement of parts that appear to be a whole with equilibrium, or a state of equalized tension, which may not always be calm. Balance is the distribution of visual weight of objects, colors, texture, and space. If the design was a scale, these elements should be balanced to make it feel stable. In symmetrical balance, the elements used on one side of the design are similar to those on the other side. So the left is equal to the right, where the top is the same as the bottom. Now, not all symmetry in art is based on balancing the left and right of a composition. In radial balance, the elements are arranged around a central point and seem to radiate out in a circular fashion. Radial symmetry creates a sense of order and harmony. And then asymmetrical balance, where all sides are different but still look balanced. Asymmetrical balance results from unequal visual weight on each side of the composition. One side of the composition might contain a dominant element, which could be balanced by a couple or more lesser focal points on the other side. Emphasis is how an artist or designer creates a focal point in their work. This can be done by allowing one element to stand out from the others, or by toning down surrounding elements in order to draw attention to one particular point. So there are 5 main methods of creating emphasis. Contrast, where part of a composition that stands out from its surroundings will draw our attention. Placement, the closer an element is to the center of a composition, the more our eyes are led to it. Isolation, something that sits separately from a group or other elements will stand out. Convergence, where lines or other elements can draw closer together to create a focal point. And the unusual, when something that seems unusual or strange is part of the composition, it will certainly grab our attention. Part of emphasis is also known as hierarchy or dominance. This condition exists when an element or elements within a visual format contain a hierarchy of visual importance. A good design contains elements that lead a reader or viewer through each element in order of its significance. The type and images should be expressed starting from the most important to the least important. And dominance is created by contrasting size, positioning, color, style, or shape. And the focal point should dominate the design with scale and contrast without sacrificing the unity as a whole. Some elements tend to stand out or attract attention more strongly than other elements, suggesting a hierarchy of importance. Elements are intentionally designed to make some look more important than others. Proportion is the feeling of unity created when all parts, sizes, amounts, or number, relate well to each other. When drawing the human figure, proportion can refer to the size of the head compared to the rest of the body. Using the relative size of elements against each other can attract attention to a focal point. When elements are designed larger than life, the scale is being used to show drama. Repetition works with pattern to make the work of art seem active. The repetition of elements of a design creates unity within the work of art. And repetition in design can work in a number of different ways. So having a repeating design element within a work is not inherently a flawed approach. Rather, repetition allows for a single point to be repeated numerous times throughout. Pattern as a principle of design may be defined as regular arrangement of repeated similar elements, like line, shape, colors, over and over again. And pattern usually increases the visual excitement by supplementing surface interest. The use of such patterns can enhance the user experience, as well as the design and the look of a final product, but must be used wisely so as to avoid a complicated layout or unattractive design. Patterns can have multiple meanings and elements in design. Repetition focuses on the same object being repeated. Patterns are made up from different components, which are then repeated in the same way throughout the design. A seamless pattern is one that flows throughout without flaw in the beginning or the end. And the entire pattern is a single coherent unit. This approach to design becomes especially important when thinking about designs which incorporate significant amounts of color, texture, or depth. Similarity is when items share some visual characteristic. They are assumed to be related in some way. The items don't need to be identical, but simply share at least one visible trait, such as color, or shape, or size. This helps them be perceived as part of the same group. Planning a consistent or similar design is an important aspect to your work to make a focal point visible. But too much similarity is boring. However, without similarity, important elements will not exist, and an image without contrast is uneventful. So the key is to find the balance between similarity and the next principle, contrast. Contrast is the principle that opposites create attraction or attractive designs. Filled versus empty, near versus far, left versus right, isolated versus grouped, centered versus off-center, top versus bottom, simple versus complex, whole versus broken, organized versus chaotic, large versus small, deep versus shallow, light versus dark, smooth versus rough, sharp versus dull, transparent versus opaque, thick versus thin, liquid versus solid, light versus heavy, stable versus unstable. Variety refers to how artists and designers add complexity and visual interest to their work. All artists and designers need to consider how they balance unity and variety in everything they make. So unity is needed so that a composition will appear as one unified work rather than just separate elements. And variety, on the other hand, is needed to create interest and prevent a work from being dull or monotonous. 3 methods for adding variety are contrast, like we just talked about, using shapes, forms, color, texture, or other elements that are very different from each other to create a dynamic, eye-catching piece. The other is difference and change, repeating similar elements but varying one aspect such as size, color, or position can create a unified composition but keep it interesting. And then elaboration. Adding detail and complexity can add interest and give the viewer more to look at and think about. Rhythm in art and design refers to a relationship between the elements that create a sense of harmony and movement. And movement is used to create the impression of action, direction, and the visual illusion of displacement. Rhythm can be seen in patterns, in relationships between colors and shapes, and in repetitions of lines and forms. Optical illusions can fool our eyes and brain to see movement that is not really there. Compositional and expressive movement encourages the eye to move around a piece rather than allowing it to settle on a particular focal point. The main types of rhythm are regular rhythm, where elements are repeated exactly in an evenly spaced arrangement. Flowing rhythm, where movement is suggested through repeating organic shapes or through irregular repetition of repeating elements. And progressive rhythm, a sequence is created in which the elements are changed slightly every time as they are repeated. And finally, negative space, also known as white space, is the empty or open space around an object that defines it. It is the breathing room around the subject that determines how appealing it looks. Most people don't like it when designs are too crowded. So giving your object or subject plenty of negative space gives them more definition. Design elements won't visually melt together. Instead, elements are broken down into sections, making them easier to process in chunks. This is much easier than trying to process the entire design in all of its parts at once. When design doesn't have enough negative space, the design will just look too crowded and complicated.